Over the past few seasons, CBH Grain has maintained above an average of about 40% of all exports of barley out of Australia. We specialise in procuring and delivering malting barley into our key markets, namely Japan, South Korea and China. I'll break my presentation down into two sections. One just focusing on China and the market and the dynamics that's going on there historically and into the future. And then I'll talk about the Australian barley industry and focus on the current production snapshot and where it could go, and the current strengths and opportunities of the Australian barley production industry. And then we'll talk about the challenges that we're facing to be able to meet this demand. So China is increasing its demand for barley, and there are three key reasons for this. One, has been mentioned many times, is the decreasing amount of domestic production in China. Number two, the Chinese beer industry continues to grow, albeit modestly, recently, and also with an increase in the malt used in the beer there. And also the most recent event is the feed barley has recently been accepted into the Chinese stock feed ration. Barley is one of the only commodities in China that the government don't subsidise in terms of a base price and also inputs. So, something like corn and soybeans and wheat, the price, they have a floor price, but then the inputs that they put into those commodities such as fertiliser, seed, chemicals is also subsidised. So barley has none of that. The guaranteed floor price for these alternative crops has recently increased. 2 to 3 years ago, and over the last few years, it keeps going up. So it becomes more and more unattainable for the local growers to chase that. And this is the historical barley import into China over the last, since 1985. So it was pretty steady there for a lot of years, but you can really see from 2008 to 2013, I call this the FAQ effect. And then the last 2 years is obviously the feed effect. And Australia's barley import, I wouldn't be standing here if this hadn't happened, has obviously increased. It's exploded into China. This year is going to be the first year that I believe that not 1 tonne of feed barley will go to Saudi Arabia out of the 2014-15 crop in Australia. It's been beneficial to the Australian grower because the Chinese have paid a premium over the Middle East. Now I'll touch on the Australian barley production. The key regions for barley production in Australia are Western Australia and South Australia. They're the main export states, and we would do probably 70% of Australia's exports out of those two states, and followed by Victoria and New South Wales, and to a small extent Queensland. Obviously a large domestic consumption on the east coast. The percentage of malting barley varieties grown in each state differs somewhat. So in Western Australia and Victoria, it's traditionally had higher percentages of malt barley varieties grown. In Western Australia, it's above 90%, and I think similar in Victoria. In South Australia and New South Wales, there's probably a higher percentage of feed barley varieties. Australian barley production, it's been increasing. Like the trend over the last 5 years has been for a pretty significant increase. So the 5-year Australian barley production average is about 8.15 million, the 10-year 7.62, and the 14 7.58. Now this isn't a factor of greater acreage going in. If anything, it's been going down, but it's more about the higher yielding varieties that are out there now and the better farming practices. The historic export of Australian barley is about 5.6 million tonnes, and the ratio malt to feed is about 40-60, so 40% malt, 60% feed. And that's about what we work on in Western Australia and South Australia for the selection rate of malt barley. Strengths and opportunities. The Australian barley production and exports continue to grow for the following key reasons. New high-yielding varieties replacing the old, strong gross margins and rotation and agronomic benefits for barley, the ability to rapidly adapt to and service the diversifying Chinese demand, the capacity to increase barley plantings and production, making the most of our geographical advantage and climate, and strong industry leadership and coordination. High-yielding varieties. So although the Australian barley plantings have probably slightly declined over the last 5 to 10 years or held steady, we've had, like I said, an increase in production. Hindmarsh was adopted by the growers very early in the piece because of its high-yielding characteristics. At the time, I think it was probably 10 to 15% yield increase above their generic traditional malt barley varieties. So, the growers voted with their feet Storage and handlers weren't offering services, but the grower was growing it anyway. They were happy to replace, high-yielding variety like Hindmarsh over their traditional malt barley varieties. Recently, Hindmarsh peaked at about 40% of the national crop, and it's helped, to be honest, fill the growing Chinese demand for cheaper malting barley varieties. I think, at the time it was controversial when it was named a food variety, but it's actually filled a void and allowed, Australia to cut out a very niche product and fill that demand and that market segment. Gross margins for barley have been very good over the last 2 seasons in Australia. This chart shows, malt barley and feed being extremely competitive to the alternative crops that we grow in Australia. We don't have a lot of crops or alternatives in Australia that we can grow. The 3 are wheat, canola and barley. As you can see by this graph, canola margins last year were terrible. So growers are talking about barley a lot. It's making the news a lot, and there seems to be a bit of a groundswell of enthusiasm for it. So don't be surprised if you see rather significant increases in barley plantings in Australia next year. Adapting to the Chinese demand. Australia has adapted well to the changing Chinese barley demand profile. Chinese demand for lower cost malt barley and FAQ has grown rapidly over the last 5 years, for reasons I've mentioned. Australian variety Hindmarsh has been used to fill the large percentage of the lower value or lower cost malting barley market demand in China, and Australia has an almost exclusive hold on the Chinese FAQ market share. Australian traders and storage and handling providers have worked hard to receive, segregate and deliver these niche products to the quality that Chinese buyers have now come to expect from Australia. Long gone are the days when Australia's single-desk giants, the grain pool and ABB, dictated terms with the Chinese, limiting the supply to and thus protecting our traditional malt barley varieties. Future challenges. Australian barley production faces a number of key future challenges, namely losing production to alternative, more profitable commodities afforded significantly higher breeding budgets, changing Australian farming enterprises looking for the path of least resistance and less risk, climate change, and the elephant in the room, too much exposure to one market.